It's Levi Brackman here with Truth, Jewish Wisdom for today. Thank you so much for joining. This is the Torah Portion Uncensored part of the podcast. Before I begin, if you like what you hear in this podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, share it with others. That helps other people find it, and it also helps with the algorithm so more people are able to see it. Thank you so much. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's jump into the Torah portion at hand. It is Nitzavim. Nitzavim is found in Deuteronomy, Devarim, Perek Chavtes, chapter 29, verse 9, Pasuk Tes. I'm going to talk about the general themes of this Torah portion and then point out some difficulties amongst them and some implications related to them and some thought-provoking ideas. So let's dive right in. So the themes of this Torah portion, I would say, are really the idea of peoplehood, the people of Israel becoming a nation through this idea of them having a covenant with God. And this covenant that they have with God actually takes place because God took them out of the land of Egypt. Part of the theme here is that this covenant is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you have the covenant, which is that there's a bris, a covenant with God, that God has this special oath, if you like, with the people of Israel. On the other hand, there's the flip side to that, which is if they don't keep this covenant, then they have all these curses. And it's really interesting, the term which is used for curses. The term in Hebrew is alah. Alah really comes from the idea of a oath. So there's the bris, which means covenant, and then there's alah, which is translated as curse, but it comes from this word of oath, making an oath. So it seems to imply that there is a covenant that God has with the children of Israel, and they need to keep that covenant. They're going to follow God's commandments, and key to that is they're not going to follow or worship any other God other than the one God, the God of Israel. But there's an oath as well on the other side, that if they abandon the God of Israel and they serve other gods, idols and gods that were not revealed to them by God, by the God of Israel, then they get all these curses which were enumerated in great detail in the previous Torah portion and also in the book of Leviticus, in Bechukosai. So it uses the word alah for the word curse. Now, it also uses other words in this Torah portion for the word curse, and that is klala, which actually is a more direct way of saying curse. And by the way, if you look through the Torah, there are other words which are used for curse as well. You find the word arur used for the word curse. For example, in Genesis, Canaan is cursed. You find the word yikov, which is also the word for cursing, and that Bilam, for example, used the word of yikov in the story of Bilam and Balak. And here it uses this word alah, which is the relatively rare form to be used as in curses. So that's one thing to point out just as a side note. But I think it is key and important to understand that there is a kind of oath that God is giving here. And that is that if you, children of Israel, keep the side of the bargain that I've given you, which is that you keep to the covenant, then everything's going to be great. But if not, then there's another type of oath that I have with you, which are all these curses. And things are not going to be great for you at all. This land that I'm giving you as part of the covenant, you can have that as long as you keep to the covenant. But if you don't, then there's another whole form of oath that I have with you, which is curses. And you're going to be thrown out of the land, and it's going to be really bad for you, etc., and all the curses that you can read in the previous portion and in Leviticus. So the Israelites end up being in this somewhat terrible situation, which is because they were taken out with a outstretched arm from the land of Egypt by God, they are forced into having to keep this covenant. And if they don't, terrible things are going to happen to them. There's nothing in between. This is really a black and white scenario. Either you keep the covenant and things are going to be good for you and you're going to get all these blessings, or you don't. Then there's another oath that I have, which is to destroy you. So that's the first part of the Torah portion, which is chapter 29. All doom and gloom. Pretty bad. This choice, binary choice that you have. Now, there's another part of this which I wanted to point out, which is in verse 18, Pasuk Yudches, it says, V'haya b'shamay es divrei ha'alah hazois, v'isbarach b'levavai leimer, Shalom yili ki b'shriris libi elech laman svois harava es hatzmeah, which translates as, and it will be when they hear the words of these curses, and they will bless in their own hearts, saying, peace will be to me, because I will follow my heart willfully to utter ruin of moist and dry alike. And this is understood to mean that an individual might say to themselves, you know what, maybe there will be curses, but I'm fine. I'm not going to be affected by these curses. So I'll do what I want, and I will follow all these non-Jewish gods, and I will serve idols. Then in verse 19, Pasuk Yutes, it says, that's not going to work for you. Why? Because lo yoyve Hashem sliach loy ki oz v'kinasoi b'ishahu v'rav tzuboy kol alah ksuv b'seif hazeh amoch Hashem eshmoy mitachas hashamayim. Because God will never forgive that person. But what will happen instead is that the anger and passion of God will rage against them till every curse recorded in this book comes down upon them, and God will blot out their name from under the heavens. In other words, you can't get away with it. You think you can get away with it, but God will find you wherever you are. And then the next verse, in verse 20, Pasuk Chaf, it seems to transition from the individual who will say this to like a whole tribe who might say this. So a whole tribe might say this. And God will separate them for bad from all the tribes of Israel, as in all the curses of the covenant that are written in this Torah. Interestingly, it talks about this book of the Torah, and the tradition is that this was a speech that Moses was given. So if Moses was given this as a speech, why does it say that which is written in this Torah? He's giving a speech. He's not holding a Torah. The Torah was written later. So why does he say it was written in this Torah? So it seems like maybe there was some book here, some written document. And then it says, what will people say about this? And it says, and the later generations will ask, and the children who succeed you, they will ask, and the foreigners who come from distant lands, they will also ask, when they see the plagues and diseases that God has inflicted upon that land, and all the terrible things, they will say, the nations will ask, why did God do this to this land? Where does this awful wrath come from? And you will say, and they will say, it's because they forsook the covenant, the God of their ancestors, made with them upon freeing them from the land of Egypt. And they went and they served other gods, and they bowed down to them, gods that was not known and that was not allotted to them. And therefore, and so God's anger was kindled on this land to bring upon it all the curses. And here use the words klala haksuv b'sefer hazeh, that was written in this book. Again, we're talking about a book. It's not just a speech, it's a book. Why would Moses use the word book when he's giving a speech? And God uprooted them from the soil, with anger and fury, of gadol, and with great wrath, and cast them into another land, as it is till this day. What does it mean, as it is till this day? Which day are we talking about? Again, that is not clear. So we have a number of different difficulties with this. First of all, it seems to be a transition from the individual saying, Ki b'shrirus libi elech, I will follow my willful heart. That seems an individual saying that, to pointing out that this might be talking about a tribe. And then it seems like everyone's been thrown out of the land. So you have this transition from the individual to the tribe getting the wrath of God, to the entire land getting the wrath of God. And the end of the chapter, it seems like it's talking about the entire land getting the wrath of God. So it's not clear how that transition actually occurs. Is it that the individual can't say, I'm okay, I'll be good doing my thing because everyone else is doing what God wants and I won't be hurt because I'm going to be just that one individual? Or is it everyone saying that and everyone turning away from God? As in the look back of what the people will say about it. They will say, what happened to this land? And they'll say, well, because they turned away from God. So that's the transition which takes place, that it's from the individual, and then looking back, it's everyone's turned away from God, not just that one individual. It very much seems like this was written as a look back, that this is what happened, rather than this is Moses saying that this is what's going to happen. Whichever way you want to put it, though, it feels very doom and gloom. This is terrible. This is what's going to happen, and it's going to be awful. We're going to be thrown out of this land. It's going to be terrible. But then as you go into the next chapter, chapter 30, it starts to look up a little bit more optimistic. And it will be, when it comes upon you, all these things, the blessing and the curse that I have given in front of you, and you take them to heart amidst all the nations that the Lord your God has banished you there. And then you will return to the Lord your God, and you will listen to his voice. All the things that I have commanded you today, you and your sons with all your heart and all your soul. Then God's going to redeem the Israelites, and he's going to gather them from the end of the earth and the end of the heaven and bring them back to the land. And that's when they repent, then God will then bring them back to the land. Interestingly, in chapter 30, when it talks about the return of the Israelites to the land, it doesn't use the idea of the bris anymore. It doesn't use the idea of the covenant. It doesn't talk about covenant. It talks about blessing and curses. Another interesting thing to point out is that it says in chapter 30, Perek Lamed Pasuk Zayin, verse 7, it says, and the Lord your God will give all these curses on your enemies and your foes who persecuted you. So these curses will now happen upon your enemies. Interesting, why does it use the word olos, which is that from the word, as we mentioned earlier, oath. What's the oath that happens with the nations? It should have used the word klala, the curses. Curses are the actions, the actual things that are happening. Allah seems to imply something to do with some kind of oath that God has, which if you do this, the negative things will happen to you. Skipping forward to verse 15, Pasuk Tesvav, it says, see that I give in front of you today the life and the good, the death and the evil. And then it goes on to say in verse 19, Pasuk Yotes, Hayidoisi b'chem hayom es hashmayim ve'es haaretz, hachayim v'mavet nasat lefnecha habracha v'haklala uvacharta b'chayim leman tichya ata v'zarecha. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I've given in front of you the life and the death, the blessing and the curse. Choose life in order that you should live, you and your children. So that's how it finishes off. Choose life. So there are a number of different ideas which really this brings up. Firstly, there's a book by William Strauss and Neil Howe called The Fourth Turning. And this book talks about how generations change over time based on the experiences that the generations have as youngsters. They become different generations. And it goes through 4 different types of generations. First the high, then the awakening, then the unraveling, and then the crisis. So the generation after the Israelites left Egypt, that was the generation of the high. This was a generation of people who are optimistic about the future and how things have changed and how things are going to be good. They're going to land, everything's going to be great. And here is Moses saying that there is a cycle here which happens. Generations change. They don't stay the same. Just like in the fourth turning, it talks about this cycle of generations. The high becomes the awakening, and the awakening becomes the unraveling, and the unraveling causes the crisis. And each generation thinks that the next generation is going to be the same as it is, and it's not going to be. It's going to change. You're going to end up with the unraveling and then the crisis. And the crisis can bring war again, terrible war and terrible destruction, which then brings about again the high. And this is a cycle that occurs over and over again. And Strauss and Howe have documented it in their multiple books. And I think that their arguments are convincing and compelling. That this is the way generations work and they change like this. So you're going to end up from the high, you're going to end up eventually in the crisis. And this is, in a sense, what chapter 29 is telling you. It's telling you, we've got the high here, but you're going to end up in the crisis in the end. But don't worry, chapter 30 says. It will change again. After the crisis, you're going to end up with the high again. Now, it doesn't say, though, that this continues to cycle over and over again. But that maybe is what it says at the end there. It says, you have the ability to change this cycle by choosing life, by understanding the cycle, and understanding that the cycle happens for a reason. It happens because people forget the consequences of what happened to people if they allow the high to turn into the awakening, then to turn into their unraveling. And if you don't remember history, and you don't remember the consequences of what could happen if you don't follow the certain rules, then it will happen again and again and again. You will end up with this cycle, perpetual cycle forever. And you'll never be able to stay and remain secure in this land. So this might explain some of these anomalies which we find in these two chapters. So in chapter 29, it talks about the covenant. And the covenant is this default thing that occurs. The Israelites have this covenant with God. That's just the way it is. It's a default situation. That covenant exists. Then you have the choice. You either stick with the covenant or you don't. Now, if you stick with the covenant, then together with that covenant comes all these laws and institutions. And if you stick with the covenant and the institutions, and you continue that as your bedrock of your society, then you won't end up with all these cycles. You won't end up in the crisis. That's, in a sense, what chapter 29 is saying. But if you break the covenant, you don't keep with institutions, you don't keep with these rules and laws, then you're going to end up with the cycle, and you're going to end up from the high all the way through to the crisis. That's just what's going to happen. And Moses, the text seems to be portraying, is saying that this cycle is going to happen at least once. You're going to end up in the crisis. But at that point when you're in the crisis, then the high is going to happen again. You're going to realize, I need to rebuild these institutions to get back to God. Now, it doesn't say get back to the covenant. It says get back to God. It says choose the blessings. Choose life. It doesn't talk about the covenant anymore in chapter 30 when it talks about returning. Because it seems that that covenant is like in the background. It's this constant which is always there. When you're returning, you're not returning to the covenant because that covenant is the flip side of the curses, which are also part of a promise, part of an oath. In other words, that covenant is not something you can change. It is always there. It's like what the Kabbalists talk about a lot in the Zohar, that the Shekhinah is in Galut. The divine presence is in the exile with the Jewish people. That idea that that covenant is always there, and what you're returning to is you're returning to God, but the covenant is always there. The covenant is this flip side of a thing that you're having the covenant, but if you don't keep to the covenant, then you get the curses. Curses in terms of what? In terms of the alah, in terms of the oath that God makes, that he's going to curse you if you don't keep the covenant. It's the flip side of the covenant. But then when you're returning, it uses a different language. It uses the language of bracha, blessings, and klala, and curses. Curses not in the sense of the oath. Because you're returning to God, then what happens, you get to the default of the blessings. So when you're looking at it from these things happened already, you've gone through that one cycle, and you've gotten to the crisis, and now you want to get out of the crisis. Now you just want to get back to default. The blessings are always there. They're always accessible. You just need to return, and then you're back to the blessings. What about then the word alah, which is used with regards to the nations, where it seems that that is part of the oath that God makes, that the default is if you keep to the covenant, then you're going to be secure in your land. You're going to get these blessings, and the people of the other lands, the enemies of the Israelites, are not going to have the ability to do what they always want to do, which is to destroy your land. They will not be able to do it while you keep to the covenant. However, when they abrogate the covenant, then the enemies do what they do, which is destroy the Israelites and drive them out of the land. But there is the flip side to an oath which God makes, which is that when the Israelites return, then the retribution gets given onto the people who oppressed the Israelites. So when it says the alah, when it says this form of oath in chapter 30, it's now talking about that kind of an oath that God makes with the Israelites, that the curses go on their enemies when they return and they choose life and they choose blessings. So if you think this curses, which is called by alah, which is used the word of oath, actually has a double meaning, that there is an oath to the Jewish people that when they abrogate the covenant, they're going to get all these curses. But then when they return, the oath continues, but it happens as curses upon their enemies who oppress them. So that's, I think, what the text is trying to say when it uses the word alah, curses in the term of oath against the enemies of the Israelites. It's not saying that there's some kind of oath against the enemies of the Israelites that they have to keep to something. They don't really seem to have a choice. They have one gear going one way, which is always to attack the Jewish people. But they will only be able to do it and be successful at it when the Israelites don't keep to the covenant. When they return to God, then they're not able to do it. And if they did do it in the past, then there's retribution, because that's an oath God makes, that I will be your retribution and I will take care of the people who oppressed you. That's what it seems to be saying. And in the end, it says that now that you've learned from this and you've seen what can occur, choose life. Don't go through that cycle again. Don't go through these 4 different cycles. Learn from history. Understand that you should remain in the high. And I've given you the tools here to remain in that high. And really interesting, the words which are used to explain this, it says, it's not that hard for you to remain in this high. Because this commandment that I have commanded you today, it is not above you. It's not far from you. It's not beyond your reach. It's not in heaven. That you might say, that one might say, who amongst us can go up to the heavens and get it for us and take it to us so we may hear it and observe it. And then it says, and it's not on beyond the sea. That one might say, who can go for us to the other side of the sea, and take it for us that we may hear it and observe it. For this thing is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart to do it. In other words, it is not that hard to remain in the high. It's not that hard to remain in the covenant. Once you understand what happens when you don't remain in the covenant, then it's not that hard to remain in the covenant. So I would say that this is really a universal message, because there is a cycle of generations, as Howe and Strauss mention in their books. And if we're not careful, we're doomed to just repeat these cycles over and over again. And we'll always end up back at that 4th turning in the crisis. And we don't want to end up in the crisis. So we need to make sure that we stay in the high generation. But to do that, we have to make sure that we have strong institutions and we stay within those rules of the covenant. Otherwise, we end up in the crisis. Now, it seems like the text is saying that you have the ability to choose to remain in that high generation and not to go through that cycle. And the text, which reverberates throughout generations, it's saying, O bacharta b'chaim, choose life. Choose life. Here, we give you the tools. It's not hard. It's not far from you. It's not difficult. These are the tools which are given to you, and choose life. But within this text, you see also a pessimism that humans are not going to choose life. They're going to choose death. But the Israelites seem to be given this very special job, this very special task of being able to choose life and have the ability to look out in front of them and see there is good, there is evil, there is curses, there is blessing, there is life, there is death. And they have the ability to actually look beyond and actually choose life. Now, whether this text was actually written in a book and said by Moses as a speech, whether it may have been written at another point of time, there are indications in this text that perhaps it was written at a different time, and I'll allow the biblical scholars to talk about that, and they all have very interesting opinions about where it came from. But one thing which seems to me sure is that there is a wisdom teaching found in these texts, and that is that there are cycles of generations, and those cycles of generations can start off with the high, as Strauss and Howe say, and end up in the crisis. And that happens also to the Israelites. But there is a way out as well, and humans don't have to go through that cycle. We can end up remaining in that stable, positive, optimistic generation, and we can choose to do that. And that imploring of the people to choose life reverberates throughout the generations, and it certainly reverberates today. There are some people in our body politic who want to say that we are inevitably going into the fourth turning right now. We're inevitably going into crisis and into war, and then we'll come out again in the high, and that is all inevitable. This section of the Torah is telling us that is not inevitable. It's in our hands. We don't have to end up in the crisis. We can change it. We can choose life. And it implores us to choose life, choose blessings, so that we don't end up in the crisis. And that, I think, is what this text is trying to convey to us. And it's a timeless truth. This has been Levi Brackman with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining, and until next time.